All right, this is Jim McRitchie, and this is the Corporate Accountability Forum where we discuss issues and possible solutions. And today our guests are Bill Burckart and Meredith Miller. And Bill is one of the co authors of this brilliant book, 21st Century Investing. I'm holding it up for those of you who are listening on the podcast. It's a great book, and it came out with another great book that John Lekumnik and
Jim Holly.
Jim Holly. Yeah, I've known Jim Holly for a long time too. Uh, Also put out last year. I think those you two did quite a few podcasts together and various things. So, and I love both the books. I think they're both fantastic. And I finally did put up a review on my website and
Oh,
on Amazon. So,
thank you.
well, Bill, why don't we start with you and you talk a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are, and then we'll turn to Meredith, and then we'll dive into the book and the heart of the matter.
Yeah, sure. So and definitely I feel like a little bit of a warm-up act for Meredith given all the great work she's been doing for years now in this space. So yeah, so just a little bit about me. So I my background I came into this industry right around the time that impact investment as a term was coined. So back to 2008 to 2007, 2008. And I had been working in kind of venture philanthropy before that, as well as doing things in kind of private sector, as well as working for nonprofits, things like that. Um, my formal education, though, really did focus on this kind of idea of systems dynamics. And so in the philanthropic space with venture philanthropy, it was really the application of system level thinking or systems dynamics to philanthropy. So it was kind of a natural extension that eventually my work would shift into the investment side and really starting to think about the applications of kind of systems dynamics thinking into investment. And it was right around 2015 that Steve Leidenberg, Steve being this kind of pioneer of the sustainable investment space, I had actually shared a piece of writing with him that was really about this idea of injecting more of like an outcomes focus into impact investing, which at that time was really output investing based on all the metrics and standards that were available.
Mm.
And Steve, in classic Steve fashion, he was like, it's fine, it's fine. He's like, but what you're talking about is version 2.0 of all of this. He's like, what I'm thinking about is 3.0. I said, well, what's 3.0, Steve? And he's like, systems. Got to think it's systems. And so that really was the impetus for TIIP. And so Steve and I, for the last 7 years have really coined the term. We've built a lot of evidence around who's doing what, and really tried to create a number of different tools, resources, and opportunities for investors to really start to move from awareness to action as they think about integrating this focus.
Great, great. Well, Meredith, I've known you for a little while, but you kept on moving around, whereas I was more or less in the same place. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I should say at the outset that I'm a proud TIP Advisory Council member. I'm also on the board of the Global Reporting Initiative, which provides metrics for corporations to report on their impact on people and planet. And so I guess I bring to this conversation an investor perspective. I've just recently transitioned from the UAW Retiree Medical Benefits Trust, which is a $62 billion fund where I was the chief corporate governance officer and worked on many of the issues that we'll be discussing today that have system level impact, including human capital management and opioids and vaccines and healthcare issues. But currently, I am the managing partner of corporate governance and sustainable strategies with Beth Young, and we continue this perspective, both very interested in this issue of systemic risk and system level investing. Prior to that, I was with the Connecticut State Treasurer's Office and also did corporate governance and proxy voting and had my first exposure to a courageous leader, Denise Napier, Treasurer Napier, who really brought so many investors in the community into climate change and diversity. She was a real pioneer in that area. And prior to that, I was at the Department of Labor enforcing ERISA in the Clinton administration, and that was preceded by 10 years in the labor movement, where I had my sort of frontline, hands-on experience with many of the issues that we're really challenged by today.
Oh, it's good to catch up after Cornell's decades ago. So,
Right.
all right. Well, Bill, why don't we dive into the book a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And you might get a sound of fighter jets flying around here. I live in San Diego, so we're kind of in the flight path. So if it starts to get muffled, let me know. But
Not
yeah, so
Ukraine.
what I was thinking for, I think the purposes of this is and give a little bit of a boilerplate. And I know for a lot of folks will be kind of digesting this just the audio. So I will try to not read from these slides, but also give a little bit more context as I go. So just this is what I was just basically saying. So TIP is, when Steve and I started, it was just this idea that the kind of conventional ways of doing investment and even some of the ways that sustainable investors were approaching dealing with a lot of these big systemic environmental and societal risks, that a lot of these approaches just weren't really up to the task of driving fundamental change, even though these problems, as they get worse, are a detriment to the planet, society, and investors' long-term returns. So at its core, TIP is this consulting services and applied research firm where we provide advice, thought leadership, and turnkey solution for investors trying to better manage systemic risks. And I guess it's probably helpful if we start with the basic definition of system-level investment. And so at its core, system-level investing is the intentional consideration by investors of the bigger picture context of their investment decisions. And as Meredith and I will talk about, this focus can get integrated into all sorts of conventional activities like RFPs, statements of investment beliefs, target investment programs, shareholder engagement activities, and manager due diligence. But investors can also leverage what we refer to as advanced techniques that are specifically designed to achieve influence at a system level. And these advanced techniques really stress collaborative action, building shared knowledge bases, setting industry standards, calling attention to public policy debates about governmental rules and regulations, and ultimately creating this kind of rising tide of investment opportunities for all investors. And the book, which Steve Leidenberg and I co-authored, really tries to provide an answer for how investors can really translate this kind of awareness into action. And so it essentially lays out this roadmap for how investors can shift their investment practices to kind of meet the challenges of modern times. And the big idea at the center of the book and our work generally is that investors need to better understand and act on this big picture context of their investments, and specifically the feedback loops between their investments and the planet's overarching systems that make profitable investment opportunities possible. So we at TIP have coined this system level investing, but we're starting to see, much like anything in this industry, different vintages spring up all around. And so to navigate this terrain, the book essentially provides the what, why, and how of system level investment, what it means to manage system level risks and rewards, why it is imperative to do so now, and how to integrate this new way of thinking into current practice. And the 6 key steps or elements of that process are the same for all investors. They set goals, they decide where to focus, they allocate assets, they apply investment tools, they leverage advanced techniques, and they evaluate results. And so for each step along the way, we illustrate the need for and benefits of incorporating a system level investment process. Now, you won't be able to read that whole thing, but I think part of it, I'll kind of go through some of these steps and I'll do it in the context. So there are any number of systemic issues, full stop, to contend with. You've got climate change, which impacts all investors across all asset classes. Income inequality, which I'm highlighting here, threatens to polarize politics, paralyze governments, destabilize democracies, so on and so forth. Pandemics disrupt economic models and require heroic efforts by government and private enterprise to keep system-wide collapse at bay. And so what's shared amongst all these issues is that they're fundamentally destabilizing, they're new and different, and social and environmental challenges. They're global. They have tipping points that once passed cannot be reversed. And these are big risks in a highly interconnected and complex world, and that they ultimately threaten long-term investment returns across all asset classes in ways that traditional risk management cannot cope with. So to bring this all into clearer focus, I'll just focus on the issue of income inequality, and what we essentially define as the gap in income between the very affluent and the rest of society. And ultimately, we've seen it in countries across the board that it's becoming this kind of systemic social challenge, and that it's only getting worse. And so, for instance, over the past 30 years, more than half of countries and nearly 90% of advanced economies have seen an increase in income inequality. And further, between 1980 and 2016, the incomes of the world's richest 1% of people grew twice as much as the poorest 50% of people. And so, in a lot of the work, both in the book and certain subsequent research, we really start to pinpoint kind of how that accelerated magnitude and interconnection and complexity really starts to play out in negative ways for society generally, but also for investors specifically. I won't go into that too much here, but just to say that it is something that ultimately does affect all asset classes. And so as we start to think about these kinds of steps that investors go through, we start with this idea of setting goals. And so in this first step, it's just this decision to integrate systemic considerations into the investment process, and really setting a goal, in this case, around income inequality, in acknowledging that this affects their investments across all asset classes. And beyond building efficient portfolios and addressing social and environmental challenges, as conventional and sustainable investors have done for many years, those choosing to take a system level approach will seek to influence income inequality themselves in ways that can generate positive impacts from the outset, benefiting all investors' returns in the long run. So for instance, CBIS, the Australian Construction and Buildings Union Superannuation Fund, has a formally stated belief that essentially that it believes that responsible investment extends to influencing the shift towards a sustainable financial system. And we see similar kinds of beliefs get reflected in goal setting from other investors. Next, investors must decide where to focus and commit to addressing a certain systemic issue. In addition to incorporating risk, return, and systemic challenges in their decision-making process, the book essentially offers system-level investors 4 additional criteria to consider when determining where to focus, and in turn, how to come to the conclusion of focusing on an issue like income inequality. These include the level of consensus on the issue, the relevance to investors, potential for impact, and degree to which uncertainty can be managed by traditional risk management approaches. CalSTRS, for example, has clearly stated its belief that 3 forms of capital, physical, human, and financial, are used to create value in the long term, making them critical to overall capital formation and health of their funds. A clear decision on where to focus. Among its human capital concerns, CalPERS includes fair labor practices, health and safety, responsible contracting, and diversity. And then after deciding where to focus, investors must allocate their assets according to addressing a big systemic issue, in this case, yet again, income inequality. And so while it's difficult to address with one singular investment, investors can utilize the levers of labor and workers' rights, CEO compensation, and taxes to address the issue. Using these levers, investors consider the ability of specific asset classes to mitigate the systemic risk stemming from income inequality and create systemic benefits from addressing this issue. For instance, the F.B. Heron Foundation has intentionally used multiple fixed income products because of their nature of building infrastructure and public goods to support local farmers in the San Joaquin Valley of California. This asset allocation pulls levers necessary to reverse the effects and prevalence of income inequality. Step 4, and we're in the home stretch of the last 3. So once these considerations are made, investors have 2 options to operate at a system level to address income inequality. First, they can extend conventional investment tools to exercise system level influence, such as investing in securities and portfolios that reflect their investment beliefs about CEO comp, taxes, and labor and workers' rights. They can also use these beliefs where they can engage with corporations and carry out due diligence on their investment managers. So take the tool of engagement. Following the reporting period of the Modern Slavery Act, HESTA, a 52 billion Australian superannuation fund for workers in health and community service sectors, engaged with all of its active managers on the presence of forced labor in their investment portfolios. The second to last step around leveraging advanced techniques. So investors can essentially leverage these advanced techniques to address the issue, tools specifically designed to manage systemic risks and rewards, what we refer to as field building, investment enhancement, and opportunity generation. These tactics differ from those historically used by conventional investors by addressing collaborative actions, building shared knowledge bases, and setting industry standards to create a rising tide of investment opportunities for all investors. Using one of these 10 advanced techniques of self-organization, 11 major investors acted on taxes, including, I never say the name right, Batiriant. It's the this is my my lack of language.
I can't help it. I don't know.
I can't help either.
MFS Investment Management, NEI Investments, Robeco Sam, Triodos Investment Management, by joining with PRI Tax Force on Taxes, which issued a guide on how and why and how of engaging with corporations on the issue. And this is something that's being, variations of this are now you're seeing manifest in various investor activities. And then the final step is around essentially helping to answer the question of so what? How do investors know that they're driving this progress? And to do so, they take this final step of evaluating results. So in addition to traditional reports on a portfolio's financial and ESG performance, the book essentially offers investors a 6-part measurement framework for system-level investments related to a manager's beliefs and actions and their effectiveness in various tasks and outcomes. In short, these 6 criteria help answer the question, did this strategy manager address income inequality? And in the real world, we can look at no further than somebody like the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, which during an RFP process asked managers to really convey their ability to facilitate the full activation of Noyes's assets to create specifically long-term systemic change. So with all of these, sorry, I should have changed that. So with all of these in place, the 6 key steps of the process are the same for all investors and really illustrates the need for and benefits of incorporating a system level perspective at each step in the process. This process essentially puts a powerful tool for change in investors' hands and one that they can really use to start reshaping a lot of these issues today. Now, it does require balance, some of which is already inherent in conventional and sustainable investment, balancing risk and reward, income and asset appreciation, social and environmental benefits and financial returns, public good or harm, and private gain. Such balancing acts may not be easy, but it does mean, and I think this is a tool for asset owners, is to really impose upon their managers that they essentially have to sharpen and demonstrate their skills. And yet again, just want to reinforce that while focused on income inequality, this process gives investors the tools necessary to engage with other system level challenges such as climate change or public health crises. I think much of which Meredith will also reflect in some of her comments about some of her great work. And then finally, yeah.
Well, so does TIIP actually, so you say turnkey solution, so does TIIP actually go in and help? Yeah, I mean, do funds hire TIIP to come in and help them, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So like we're wrapping up a consulting engagement with a pension fund now that's building an investment belief statement specifically focused on systemic considerations. And we've worked with others, Domini Impact Investments, for a number of years as they've developed their own system level investment program that's been applied across their activities. And that's the kind of work we do. So it's a lot of, TIIP has to essentially walk on 2 feet. One is the industry building and kind of marketplace building for this, which is reflected here in some of these activities that we're up to. And then the other is taking a lot of this thinking and frameworks and evidence and helping to apply it into the context of investors that are looking to kind of revamp what they're doing to reflect a system level focus. So we walk on 2 feet, but yeah, that's the idea, is that we do kind of big thought leadership that's breaking new ground and then applying it in the real world. And we have great advisors like Meredith Miller to help us really bridge that divide.
Are the clients typically pension funds or mutual funds, or?
It's a combination. It's so pension funds, big long-term institutional investors tend to be, I think, most primed for this. So it's a combination of pension funds, foundations, and endowments that are kind of, uniquely positioned to do this and get their hands around it. But we are starting to see a lot more interest from asset managers and, in particular, advisors and consultants. They continue to be this kind of potential enabler or blocker for investors as they attempt to move in this direction. So we ultimately do a lot of work with them as well, trying to help drive a lot of awareness, education, training, and just generally equipping that kind of intermediary market to help facilitate this focus.
That's good. I go to CalPERS board meetings occasionally, and their advisors play a very key role in
Yeah,
determining their investments, evaluating the whole thing. So yes, those intermediaries are very important.
absolutely.
Okay.
I'd be curious what Meredith's take is on
Yeah.
how important they are, given that she's really done a lot of what we talk about. So
Well, I think, what I would say, Jim, is that, what TIP brings to the conversation, and perhaps maybe the paths already taken by a lot of our colleagues who are institutional investors, is that it brings the ability to also look at impact. And I think a lot of funds right now have sort of are it's more mainstream, as you know, to try to integrate ESG factors in whether it's your investment, your asset manager RFPs, or their performance, or your own direct investments. But this really, and this is what Bill's sort of taught me, is that it brings the promise of what ESG was going to do, which is it takes it that one step further and allows you to look at impact, and which I think a lot of funds are beginning to want to do, not only impact on these broader, people and planet platforms, but also look at the impact that these kinds of system level risks have on the portfolio. Because at the end of the day, what Bill's really saying is you can't diversify away these, these very big system level risks. And, people always trot out this, but it's a really important sort of factoid that in fact, 90% of the variation in the returns that investors receive is due to the risk of the securities in our portfolios, and not stock selection, by our managers. And since we're universal owners, and often broadly, exposed across sectors in the market, these are inextricably tied together. And so I think that the TIP analysis for me as an investor, as I think about it, really forces two things. One is it really pushes the folks that do engagement to harmonize with the folks that do investments, so that these themes and these issues around whether it be human capital management or inequality, broadly speaking, climate change, that there's this integration through the investment process, engagement and investing, and that they be sort of considered on par. And so it's an important, and that there be this feedback loop. So that's the other thing that really distinguishes this framework. It's not just, looking at risks that externalities pose on a firm. It's not just looking at risks that the firm poses on people and planet, but it looks at the feedback and the impact, as people have perfected, obviously, in the climate risk analysis. But now we're really beginning to look at it when we look at examples and practical applications on racial wealth gaps and on human capital management issues, broadly speaking.
One of the things is, like, say, companies. I know we've gone after companies to not just measure the CEO by total shareholder return. And I'm wondering, so we try to ask companies to evaluate their CEO on other accomplishments like CEO reduction and diversity inclusion. Are investment managers doing something similar? It's kind of funny because I go to, talk to some investment managers, and it seems like a lot of them have been what I believe is kind of corrupted by, okay, what's the CEO pay model? And they use much the same model at several funds as far as salary surveys of comparable, and then the typical ratcheting up every year because our CEO is above average, and we face those same problems. Are making a dent in any of that?
Well, some of the actually, it's kind of coming at it from a different, a little bit slightly different angle, which is that if you look at impact measurement reports, you'll begin to see asset managers have now logged several of these in. BlackRock has an impact report on their website. So it's taking a system level issue and it's showing you their investments and actually using I think GIN or IMP's metrics to show the impact. So there are beginning to be, and I do believe this really fits in nicely with the TIIP analysis. Now, these are on discrete issues. This isn't like we've now hired, I can't speak for specific asset managers, but I think one thing that Bill and TIIP are really looking for is this capacity building within the investment field. We have a lot of expertise on the engagement side. I mean, we know our colleagues, the folks at Majority Action, Climate Action 100, Human Capital Management Coalition, ICCR, SOC Investments. A lot of folks have been really working on formulating and really tracking through the impact that a company's actions may have, and on posing reputational risk, but also legal and regulatory risk and the impact on the economy. So I think that beginning to ask these questions, I think that Bill talked about in the RFP and the due diligence efforts on the asset manager side is that harmonization that I'm talking about. Like we're really I do a lot of funds have identified what are material risks for their funds, and this is now really taking it to the next level, which is really asking, do they have the capacity and are they thinking about how they're looking, how the investments in specific either sectors or on these issues are having an impact, positively, negatively.
Yeah, and the thing I would just add to that, so I mentioned the HESTA example where they started to apply their kind of thinking across and engage all of their active managers around the presence of forced labor. But take something like executive compensation. What we're essentially trying to get investors to walk on 2 feet. So we're basically saying, right, so whatever this new standard is that you think in terms of staying on this issue of executive compensation, whatever you think the ceiling needs to be on this, imposing it across all of your investments, that's one thing. And obviously reflecting whatever you're imposing, reflecting it on yourself as well. But then really thinking about, okay, how do we start to drive greater adoption of this same kind of thinking across the investment community? One of the things that we often will say, so take an example like imposing like a living wage in different, so if you're a sustainable investor, you might look at your portfolio and just make sure it's like, to what extent are we paying labor across all of our different investments? And how do we make sure that there's a baseline standard that's being applied across all of them? Okay, take it another step to say, how do we start to establish a living wage or establish a reasonable wage for not just your portfolio companies, but also for an entire industry and or entire sector? And so it's really starting to think about, okay, how do we do that? And then how do we mobilize other investors to advocate and demand the same thing? And so that's part of, as we start to think about that, like the difference in approach. And that's why we do this whole like eat this, not that, like we make these comparisons between conventional, sustainable, and system level, is to help people kind of understand that it's not just about what you're doing with your portfolio. It's really about how you're using that example to really start to influence the behavior of other investors to do this at scale, to really drive bigger fundamental change.
Well, that just brings to mind when you said going after an industry and talking to union folks in Germany, they do bargaining by industry, whereas in the United States, and we had that to some extent, I guess, with the auto workers. But in most sectors, it was divide and conquer, and the union didn't get to bargain with a whole industry at once. Mm-hmm. And so now it looks like we're getting investors that are bargaining with whole industries at once.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the work that when I was co-leading with the UAW, was co-leading with Mercy and now with Share in Canada, the
Uh-huh.
Investors for Opioid and Pharmaceutical Accountability. It's really interesting to see that, started back in 2017 out of concern that now here you have the whole supply chain of, it's an interesting example of system level, because you've got like distributors, manufacturers, and retail pharmacies, and you have over 20 companies, 52 resolutions. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is creating these sector-wide best practices and then carrying it to a legislative and policy level, as Kevin Thomas has done in Canada, using, I think we got 18 misconduct clawbacks. These are those the clawback provisions that New York City worked on and made well known in the Goldman Sachs and some other examples. And so 18 of them across, and they're all on the website for ICCR. If you just do ICCR opioids, you'll find them. But even more than that, they've been able to institute these board risk reports, move on to board risk reporting. So there are, and that's a great issue, where that was costing, like, predicting like 2.8% of GDP, and just it was an amazing, and it still is. The IOPA is still working hard, and at the end of the day, we're able to return for the first time without even totally triggering a clawback, was able to return a reduction in bonuses, money back to investors, and try to instill certain risk mitigation efforts going forward for these companies. But I also think of like the ICCR work on the vaccine transparency, where that is even the big, huge global impact. And Meg Jones Montero is just really leading this incredible health equity initiative on the transparency of the pricing of vaccines by companies around the world. And and you can, the business case for that is, and the health case for that is well known and compelling. But what's interesting is the resistance of companies to actually disclose about this, even though we have to provide accessible and affordable vaccines in order to stop this repeat pandemic. I would say they had an incredible settlement with Moderna, where they were able to get pages and pages of this kind of transparency and looking at barriers and access. I mean, and that's just like a great example of something that is very current and ongoing, and they still have resolutions at Merck and J&J for 2022 season for companies that have not disclosed to their satisfaction.
Yeah, we've talked about ICCR and the whole resolution package. I was talking to somebody the other day who works at Bloomberg, and he's put together it's basically a news feed for Bloomberg subscribers, which I don't happen to be one because it's so expensive. But there are a bunch of funds that announce their votes in advance, like Norges, for example. So, more than $1 trillion, 5 days before the AGM, they announce all their votes. And and of course, there's been a lot of SRI funds and CalPERS, CalSTRS, other funds that announce their votes in advance. And now he's seeing that these feeds about how a fund votes are getting interest not from the usual folks like the corporate governance nerds or the the ESG folks, that half of that, not half, that little wing of the industry, but they're actually getting a lot of response from the buy and sell folks. So, should I be shorting this stock because of this vote? Or, they're really taking a much stronger look at that. So that's part of that integration that we hopefully will get to, and bringing them into that whole feedback loop that you folks are trying to create. Because it's
a great point.
Eric.
Yeah, I have a question. you know, what do you think is driving demand for your services? This wasn't really a business, say, 7, 10 years ago. And I'm asking it in the context of there's ESG consideration now, but going to the next level and taking system-wide investment into consideration is a different kind of jump. So I'm curious as to what's driving the demand for that between, marketing and asset gathering purposes, perceived fiduciary responsibilities, um, just knowing how to respond and having a framework in place to respond to all the shareholder resolutions that are out there in a responsible manner, whether the company wants to take a more visionary, the firm wants to take a more visionary approach. Can you talk a little about the driving factors and what's going to cause us to this aspect to continue to grow and be accepted and be implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is yes to everything you just laid out. But yeah, but so I mean, and Meredith started to touch on this. I think there's an acknowledgement from it a couple of levels. And honestly, in some ways, it's not dissimilar, I think, to kind of a lot of the myths around sustainable investing and the embrace of that kind of otherwise prevented people, or they hid behind, to not integrate. And so part of it, back in the day, it was like, well, will investors actually demand this? Is it a passing fad? Does it actually lead to long-term performance, or does it lead to concessionary returns? A lot of these things were projected onto sustainable investing in the early days, and I think they're starting to, be refuted now, thanks to, long-term data. I think when we started, when Steve and I were just like getting this rolling, I often refer to it as like the intersection for system level investment was not very crowded. And there were like a few other cars that were maybe on the other side of the street, but that was about it. But I think that there's been a couple of things. I think one is, it sounds like a broken record now, but these once in a millennia events. So whether it's the globe being reshaped by climate change, whether it was a financial crisis or recession brought on by risk takers, right? Whether it's income inequality and a lot of issues related to what the pandemic has helped to both intensify. It didn't create these problems, but it definitely intensified them. All of these things are happening in fairly quick succession in a way that we just, we're starting to see these things as happening with more frequency and more intensity. And it's people are starting to understand that the context or the operating environment of their investment decisions is now playing out in a way, and it's extremely interconnected and influencing performance, particularly over the long run. So if you are a long-term institutional investor right now, and you're thinking about, well, it's not just about what does our performance look like in a year? If you're paying out the promise to your beneficiaries 75 years from now, you really do have to start to take that into account. I mean, take GPIF, biggest pension fund in the world in Japan. They don't refer themselves as a long-term investor. They refer to themselves as a super long-term investor because they have a 100-year time horizon. Things like climate change, which, by 2050, if we don't get our act together, is going to start to reshape, everywhere. And the migration patterns that come as a result, the environmental destruction that comes as a result, all of these things I think investors are starting to better understand the kind of material impact of these issues. And that some of these issues really do cross-cut across industries like climate change. Like if you look at SASB standards, climate change affects the majority of the industries that SASB tracks. That's a big thing. And we didn't have that data before, we do now. And then Meredith's point about kind of, where the variation of returns really come from, it's the performance of the overall market, not necessarily individual stocks. And so when you're a universal owner and you're exposed across the market, that's something that you then have to consider, I think, with more intentionality than you did in the past. I guess the final thing I would say, and then I'd be curious for Meredith to reflect on all this, and I often say this, it's like, and I have the benefit of having a business partner that, was around in the early days of sustainable investing. And the way that he often refers to it as like, back in the day, if you take something like the Love Canal in Buffalo, that like it was so polluted, it started burning. That was something that was like starting to permeate back in the early days of sustainable investing is like, and this is what helped to galvanize investors and things, and just general actors taking action. We're not talking about a polluted river anymore catching fire. We are literally talking about melting polar ice caps, and the uncertainty associated with that, about how fast it's going to really happen, the implications for society, for the environment, all of these things. These are big things, and there's just a different level of challenge that we have to now grapple with. So I think all of these things are starting to really permeate. And then the final thing is just changing demographics. Younger investors and female investors are just disproportionately more likely to want to engage in this way. And they're being influenced by regulatory changes around stewardship and things like that that are just starting to permeate, I think, in a much more visceral way for folks. It's a lot of things to answer your question, Eric. It's all of these things. But Meredith can put a finer point on that.
Oh, no. I actually, even bigger. It's a great question. You know, there are 3 climate change standards, well, 2 out and 1 about to happen from the SEC that are really, really important for us to keep in mind, not to mention the TCFD just alone, many companies and investors pushing on that climate action 100 and majority action. And so we have the EU that has a climate standard out under their whole green economy move, which is mandatory, right? And then we have the IFRS coming out from the International Accounting Standards Board, which will be voluntary, but many, as Bill mentioned, you know, it's sort of built upon a lot of the SASB reporting as well that has been built up in the past few years. And then we are expecting the SEC in the States to issue their climate change disclosure standards. So we have this very interesting moment in time where and a lot of companies have already jumped, and investors have really put the heat on, I think, in the last few years. So we've already seen commitments made, but now we're seeing, based upon, you know, COP26, new commitments to climate that I think brings back this whole systemic risk. I was looking at Amalgamated Bank has this great report on net zero climate target reports, where now you're seeing companies even take it and they're a leader in the banking sector, take it one step further in instituting science-based targets. So now we're getting really serious about the timelines and goals, and they have perfect setup in terms of looking at impact analysis for their commitment to 2045. But the other piece that's coming out from the climate and the system level view on climate change is just transition. And that's a really interesting area, that also an issue that connects so not just even the oil and gas sector, but transportation, many other sectors. I even see it in the hotel workers' concerns about, you know, going to not cleaning a room for a few days and the impact, health and safety impact on their workers. So just transition, there are all sorts of frameworks on that, all sorts of good work. The AFL-CIO is leading in tremendous work. SOC is leading work on that. And then I would also say we're getting rules that will be mandatory very soon on human capital management from the SEC. So that'll be very interesting. That was prompted by the petition for rulemaking that the Human Capital Management Coalition, now led by CalPERS and UAW Trust,
Meredith, can you speak to what you think might be in those?
Sure. I mean, I do think that in the human capital management disclosure, I can tell you what I'm hoping will be in there,
Okay,
but
yes.
but
Let's
my
put our hopes
best
out there.
guess is that there will be a codification of the disclosure on diversity, DE&I. There'll probably be. I don't know if it'll look exactly like the NASDAQ disclosures, but folks should take a look at that as well.
Oh, for
And
the board, or not?
for the board, yeah. And I don't know about workforce-related diversity disclosures, or whether the EEO disclosures will be embedded in that. It's a really good question. I'm not sure. I do know that the Human Capital Management Coalition has been looking at, just a discrete number of issues, looking at contingent workers versus full-time workers, a number of issues around comp, and they look at the whole workforce and the velocity of promotion by race, gender, and ethnicity. And turnover has been a very key issue. So I think that some mix of those metrics will be coming out, and a lot of boards are preparing for that and really looking at how they can gather the data, and that leads to a lot of the issues. And I really commend TIP's work on income inequality. The last report that they put out, which is very recent, right, Bill? There's one that just came out. It really is a fantastic review of the business case from an investor point of view on income inequality, and then it does a great sweep of all the current initiatives in this area. And as Bill said, the sort of distinction, so you can see where you fit in. Are you this kind of investor? Are you that? Or are you reaching or striving towards,
So
system
that's a
level?
current report out?
Yes.
Yeah, it's called Systemic Stewardship Investing to Address Income Inequality, that TIP produced. Yeah.
Yeah, the one
You can, yeah. And feel free to share a link with attendees. Yeah.
I mean,
Well-
and I just wanted to add, Jim, real quick. A lot of the TIP tools and the reports, of which there are many, are all in the public domain. They're right on the website, and they have tremendous resources, and as many other groups as well. But having information in the public domain is really great. You don't need a subscription.
Yeah, that's great. One thing is I wish people would talk more about wealth inequality as well as income inequality, because wealth, once you have a big, huge pile of money, uh, it's hard to, well, like one of the things I think it was in your book, or maybe it was in Lekumnik's book about, if you add $1 to the top 20%, you get back whatever it was, 0.08% to GDP. Whereas if you add $1 to the bottom 20%, you get 0.38% increase in GDP. And it just seems like large investors like the Japanese fund, should be looking at things like that. Okay, well, we are dependent on the growth of the economy, and we should be investing in not CEO pay, but a little lower down the food chain.
Yeah, and there are on the SOC Investment Group website, there are these incredibly well-researched letters that they actually have sparked the civil rights and racial audits that are in these shareholder resolutions. One of which is coming up the end of this week at Apple. And they do have a lot of data that points to the issues that you're talking about, Jim. They have the Citigroup study that shows the failure to address racial wealth gap in wages, housing, and investment has cost the economy $16 trillion over the last 20 years. And what's interesting about these audits that they have requested, that they're soup to nuts, they're from the firm level to the products and the services and the impact, on their stakeholders. So it's another great example to add into the mix.
What's the SOC? Remind me.
Oh, it was changed to WIN, Strategic Organizing Campaign.
Oh, okay. I'm still living in the past.
Yeah. Change to WIN has now got a new name, and so SOC Investment Group. But a lot of it's a really nice sort of sister piece to the work that TIP has done.
Yeah, and the only thing I would say, just to build on that, we specifically developed this framework around like deciding where to focus on, like what constitutes a systemic issue. And so we grapple with things like, is there global consensus on this, that it is an issue of global importance? We also talk about the kind of effect, whether or not the issue has an influence on investor long-term performance. Like, can we demonstrate there's a connection? And then one of the other criteria is really around effectiveness. So what can investors actually do to influence this issue in terms of these kind of levers that they can pull? So there was an essential reason why we didn't focus on economic inequality or wealth inequality. We focused on income inequality, because we saw it as an issue where some of the other issues really it's the domain of policy to handle, not necessarily investors to handle, or at least the most effective levers are more about policy interventions as opposed to investor interventions. So in the context of income inequality, the reason we focused on CEO comp and labor and taxes, just because investors that are primarily operating through public markets, that these became levers that they uniquely could pull to start to exercise influence.
So I'm fighting a no action from Facebook, Amazon, and another. So I have a proposal out asking companies to just tell us, where did those incentive shares go? So since 2003, shareholders have had to vote on incentive shares. Okay, you don't get to create incentive shares and disperse them throughout the company, and they mostly get dispersed to the CEO, the board, and the executive level. So and so that, of course, these companies are arguing back. Well, that's worker pay. That's exempt. We don't have to deal with that. But it seems like if shareholders have to vote on, and I'm just asking, describe where those incentive shares go. Do they all go to the CEO, or do they go to people at the bottom of the heap, or and that's a wealth building thing. We're going to have on next week, I think it is, people from National Center for Employee Ownership, and there was another organization in San Francisco, I think, that did a little study. They showed what would happen to wealth inequality if a third of company stock was owned by workers. And of course, that's not going to happen. That's kind of a pipe dream, but maybe 10%, 5%, something. And but it would have a huge effect on wealth inequality, especially for women and minorities. So anyway, just throwing that out. So we are nearing the end of our time. So if people have questions, we are going to close it down fairly soon. So yes, share.
Okay. Some of the largest asset managers have said that they're going to be voting on these ESG issues in board elections. Is that the right lever for investors to be using when it comes to oversight?
So I think it's an important lever, right? I think is the short answer is.
Well, you're saying board versus the individual topics of shareholder proposals. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So they've said, because shareholder proposals, in their words, are 1% of the universe, they believe that boards hold oversight responsibility. They're going to vote at board elections versus voting on shareholder proposals, unless they think that governance has been really compromised, or there's been some major issue specifically on climate change or board diversity and other issues.
So I want Meredith to react to that, but my basic point here, and this is just kind of stepping back for a second. One of the things that's happened over the last couple of years, oftentimes when we'll talk about system level investment, is people will say, well, give me an example of a perfect system level investment, i.e., what's the kind of most effective mechanism for investors to use to really exercise this idea and this influence. And what we always say is like, well, it's not just allocation of assets, or it's not just a specific approach to accountability, that you have to look at the totality. And what we reflect in all of our writing and the kind of consulting we do is that this is one of those things that it's not a either or, we do it in this one particular venue, but we don't in this other. You have to do all of it. And there's going to be, in some cases, inherent contradictions, even in some of the system level techniques that we talk about, that you have to be mindful of, like, could these things work at cross purposes, things like that. But at the end of the day, you kind of have to keep every tool in the toolbox on the table. And the idea of ignoring certain things that we know drive certain kinds of fundamental change, taking that off the table is, I think that's a limit, like that's a limited view, I think, by asset managers. But Meredith, maybe you want to react to that.
Yeah, no, It's a great question. I always think of it as what would you say? Is it a difference without a distinction, or distinction without a difference? Because I do think a lot of the issues that have come up in shareholder resolutions are a direct result of a request for a governance reform, whether it be disclosure, whether it be taking some kind of action that at the end of the day always leads back to board oversight. So I do think and sometimes for companies, it can actually be helpful for them to be able to move when they have their, I know from some of the corporate secretaries we've worked with, I do think that the board, there have been issues that are system level issues that have now been converted, as you say, into board level competence, and capability, like in the climate issue. But I would hate to see a complete trade-off in that, because to me, they're inextricably tied together.
Well, it seems like a very old argument to me, because I used to, when I used to be on panels or be in the audience, and I would ask folks from BlackRock, how come you're not voting for any of these people? Oh, well, we're voting against directors when we think there's a problem that, rises to that kind of level. And basically their argument was, well, they were negotiating with the company over, say, climate or, DEI issues or whatever it was. And as long as they were negotiating, they weren't going to vote against the item. Well, then, of course, what did the companies do? They just string BlackRock along forever. We're still thinking about this. We're still negotiating. And I think that we have seen a change at BlackRock, and I think we're starting to see changes at a lot of other funds where they are now voting, whereas they did take that attitude, well, if we think they're a problem, we're just going to vote against board members. But now they seem to be actually voting on proposals, even though proposals are advisory. And, whereas when you vote on the board at many companies, not all, it does have an impact. Some companies don't have a majority vote standard. So any final questions from anyone?
Just to observe, I help with the IOPA and ICCR health work with proxy advisors, with asset managers, and some other conversations with asset managers around our resolutions. And we've been putting in a slide each time on system stewardship and kind of universal owner kinds of things. And yet the two very large proxy advisors and almost universally the large asset managers will be familiar with the argument, but generally will say, because we look at it just on this particular company. So we've had some internal conversation, but basically said, we need to keep putting that argument inside the deck, just because in time we can kind of scratch away at some of the resistance. I'll add, we had a conversation with one asset manager this morning that was exceptionally retrograde. I appreciate their candor, but it was not, it was like something that might have happened in a conversation shortly after Milton Friedman wrote a Times column.
Chris, one thing that really strikes me, because you and I have worked together closely for so long, is that so many of the issues that even if you presented it on a discrete company by company basis, they had no action. And the reason that, Beth Young's fantastic defense made it through many of the no actions on behalf of ICCR and IOPA is because the issue was socially significant, and that it held certain potential impact for other investors in the economy. So it may be that we need to put in the history of the resolution itself, because it has already been deemed to be socially significant and be material.
that retrograde asset manager today, we actually appealed saying, they fought us at the SEC about this. And they said, well, this SEC basically tells us anything goes, so it doesn't matter. They were discounting anything coming out. It's like, oh.
Oh, no.
The other interesting thing I've been thinking about, just because of world events, is like what system stewardship might say to the whole question around Ukraine, Russia, and sanctions and the like. Right. Somebody pointed me toward the top holders of Gazprom, the large Russian gas company.
That's right.
Many of them are Western funds, mutual funds, and things like that. And you can decertify Nord Stream 2, but that's empty. Nord Stream 1 continues to be quite full. And just the kinds of concerns around that, and how a more robust human rights framework might have kept the United States from being of the top 3 foreign investors in Russia over the last, in 2020, we were in the top 3, so, but
That's a good point.
Well,
I'll wait for somebody else to come up with that kind of.
yeah, I don't see anybody jumping on that, so I'm
Well,
going
I
to
mean,
move on.
there is a lot written in the last 24 hours that there's going to be a big climate debate over liquefied natural gas, and that is going to be a huge issue because I think they're expecting to export a bunch of that to Europe when they are cut off. So I think that your point is a really good one, Chris, that we're now in this scenario right now, and doesn't seem to have been something that the markets are reacting to 5 hours by 5 hours. But this is all the ownership and investments are now coming to light.
So I got 2 more questions here. So from Jane, and then I guess I will read Faye Feeney's because she says she has background noise. So, and then we'll cut it off after that. My wife was telling me this morning, well, you should leave them wanting more instead of begging you to stop. So, so Jane.
So I'm going to ask a sort of classic risk management from an ERM perspective, enterprise risk management question. And that's how do you address those sort of contextual changes that Chris has brought up within your system and your evaluation process? So at what point do you go back and reassess whether your investment portfolio is still doing what you expected it to do? And how is that triggered by contextual events? And then the other sort of almost linked question to that is, you're talking a lot about holding corporates to account. Could this be expanded perhaps to hold governments to account?
Yeah, so great question, Jane. And I think how we generally approach this is, so our unit of analysis is really on, well, our theory of change is really about moving asset owners to kind of demand this focus and help them equip themselves to integrate that across their value chain. And really, it's about a lot of how they can then reflect that purpose and that intention with their managers, with their advisors, so on and so forth. And so a lot of the, I think, onerous of controlling for a lot of these contextual developments that might occur in these constantly evolving systems. I mean, that's the other thing that I guess is like really important to get across here, is that these things they're changing in real time. And a lot of like the even ways that we think about how investors can evaluate managers and really the kinds of metric sets that managers should ultimately be reporting on, they get into this, and we struggled with this for a while. Our first kind of real perspective on it, we released in 2018. There's this report called Measuring Effectiveness. And a lot of what we talked about was flipped in the context of climate change. And a lot of what we were coming up with was really this idea of how do you start to understand the durability of the systems that you're operating within. And so a lot of the metrics, so when you think about that kind of, it's a dynamic quality. And so how do you start to capture that in terms of the metrics that you're ultimately managing against? And so we would talk a lot about, each system has different stresses and breakdowns. And so in climate change, it's fundamentally the systemic health indicator that we should be trying to manage is around adaptability. In an issue like income inequality, it's around connectivity, in terms of, so adaptability in the sense that we're too reliant on fossil fuels and that we need to be adapted, i.e. diversify all of the different fuel sources, not go full tilt towards solar or full tilt towards, clean gas. It's the idea you have to do all of these things. And with income inequality, it's just the idea that the ultimate shareholders are so disconnected from the lowest paid employee of the companies that they ultimately have holdings in, that how do you start to foster it? It's like what David Weil at Berkeley talks about, fissuring of the workplace. and that different issues also is a lack of directionality or a lack of clarity in terms of the component parts of these systems. So when I hear things like with the situation with Ukraine, or there was a while, and I think it was 2020 maybe, that Responsible Investor went on this like whole thing about framing Trump as a systemic risk and like what does that mean, and that sort of thing. And what we often talk about is that, look, there's only a subset of issues that are of the magnitude that through our framework really get to the system level. And so that's what fundamentally that you as an investor should be calibrating for, and that you should be demanding from across your value chain. But all of these contextual dimensions, though, if these investors are really applying this kind of thinking consistently and comprehensively across all of their activities, you start, when these developments occur, your ability to adapt in the face of them just gets improved or strengthened. And so part of it is, there's not like a panacea response to this. It's just simply to say that like Ukraine, okay, that's one issue. The pandemic was one issue. There's going to be a number of these catalysts that happen. And so it's coming up with like a fundamental process that is ultimately focused on a specific set of systems or a specific system. And that as these developments occur, your ability to adapt and reshape in the face of them, because they're going to be different in terms of how they affect the specific systemic issue that you're trying to influence. That's where that the control factor for these developments gets into play. That's kind of like there's a longer discussion there. We should have an entire session on measurement question, but that's how we've tried to control for it a little bit. I don't know, Meredith, if there's anything, but it gets really yeah. So that's a longer conversation, but hopefully that's helpful. But I'm happy to unpack it further. That was a great question, Jay.
Okay, well, I'll go to the last question then from Faye Feeney. And I think this is related to a position that Faye just accepted. So do you see investors taking on director skills and competencies for these new systematic risks like climate, digital, and human capital? By age, the boardroom is filled with leaders raised in an analog world. What expectations do you think investors can set for director learning, structure, and oversight to address these issues?
You want to go first, Meredith?
No, you go ahead.
I mean, yes, is the short answer. Is that this should be? I mean, so we're wrapping up consulting engagement with a pension fund that basically decided that they wanted to revamp their investment beliefs to really reflect those systemic or system level considerations. That whole process, it was a combination of just general like baseline education on when we talk about investment belief statements, like what does that mean, where does that fit in your governance structure, what are the implications for other governance documents and policies that you might have in place, as well as just general level of education on when we talk about issues, these environmental social governance issues. There's those that really directly influence the portfolio, then there are these big systemic ones that have these bigger implications. That whole process, it took, we did one-on-one prep and interviews with all the different trustees, with the C-suite, with other key members of the staff. And it was a multi-month process to kind of get their hands around it. I mean, there was definitely some people that were already there and they're like, no, I know what you guys are talking about. You don't need to give me the 1.0, like, let's just jump into it. But it was a concerted choice and program that we put in place in collaboration with this pension plan to really start to bring everyone along. And I think it's super important. It's a great question because at the end of the day, and like even with our turnkey solution stuff, at the end of the day, it's like, and we've been very clear about this with subscribers too and all that, is that you need multiple layers of your institution involved in this. It takes a commitment across the organization if you're going to do this. So it's super important that trustees are informed and ready to act on it. So yes, education and training and like doing that whole thing is 100% fundamental to, I think, success in this regard.
And I would just add that I do, Faye, as you do, see more committees, more discrete committees developed, and I do see compensation committees changing names rapidly to include human capital or human resources. I do think that there's going to really be an important change perhaps communication with management, more collaborative work and reporting up of, because when I did a session with directors on human capital, and a lot of directors said, you know, I'm just not steeped in human capital analytics. You know, like it's one thing to give me 5, but to give me all, you know, what is the retention ratio normally within the industry. So I do think that'll change, and there'll be a really important changed relationship between management and directors, as well as directors changing committees and new committee, stronger charters, and very, you know, more specific oversight in this area. So I see it happening. I'm in some of these director organizations myself, and I do see huge amounts of education going on. So it's both challenging, but also seems to be very exciting developments for all involved.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our guests this week, Bill Burckart and Meredith Miller, and I want everyone to go on the TIPS website and read the reports. And I love this one that I'm holding up, Systematic Stewardship Investing to Address Income Inequality. I thought that one is fantastic. So, and I haven't read them all, so I've got to take a deeper dive. And come back next week when we're going to have Corey Rosen and Jack Moriarty. They're going to be talking about employee ownership and how that fits into this puzzle. So, thanks very much, folks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks, Jim,
Thank you.
Eric, Bill, everyone.
There's Fred.
Bye.